Let's begin. Donald Trump promised to be a dictator on day one. Immediately after an Arctic inauguration, defined by Elon Musk's fascist salute, he began signing executive orders and throwing pens to adoring fans. They are as awful as you might expect. What do they tell us about priorities? Reed, I've noticed that the verb choice here is actually quite tricky because technically an executive order is more than proposing something, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to happen. Can you just briefly explain what are they and what are their limits?
Sure. So the idea here is that an executive order is an action that the president of the United States can take, assuming that there has already been legislative or congressional approval somewhere else, if that makes sense. There's already a law on the books somewhere that says they can do this. And so they are just utilizing their authority either under that particular legislation or under the bounds of what the president of the United States can do from a national security perspective as commander in chief of the armed forces, whatever that might be. And so, that's what they are. A lot of times, they are uh, ceremonial in nature, right? I care about these things, but we have seen throughout history too that, you go back to the immediate post World War II era where Harry Truman signed a number of executive orders about how the national security apparatus of the United States was going to be set up, many of which are still in force today. So they can be very powerful instruments for Trump, like so many other things. They are first and foremost a part of the shock and awe of all this,
Right.
right? Here's what we're going to do and to whom we're going to
Well,
do it.
that's it, because I think it's about a tenth already of the number he did in his entire first term. So is it just about the power of momentum and dominating the conversation and sending people scrambling?
All of those things. I think you just hit all of them on the head. I mean, so you take who Trump cares about. Trump really cares about those oligarchs that were arrayed behind him a couple of days ago at his inauguration, but he knows that it's his base, his fervent now Republican MAGA base that really gives him the power he needs, if that makes sense. Like he's already got the power and the money. He likes rich people because he always wanted to be one of them. But now this is really a sop to the base, to the average rank and file, very committed Republican voter to whom he made these promises. And then you also have, as you said, the idea that it keeps him in the middle. That is his superpower. And I use that phrase intentionally. He is very, very good at this. And so it keeps him in the middle of the conversation. And that happens because whether or not it's the mainstream media, such as they are, or the online left, such as they are, immediately go into a tizzy. And it's just like we were talking about. It doesn't matter after a decade of doing this, how many times he does this, so many people still fall for it as opposed to saying, okay, what does this really mean? What's going to happen? Very bad things will happen. We should expect that. The question is now, how do we react?
Well, one executive order proposed to revoke birthright citizenship for the future children of undocumented immigrants and people on student visas, which unambiguously contravenes the 14th Amendment. So is the idea that this is just not going to happen, but he's showing to his base what he wants to do, or do you think the Supreme Court could wave that through?
I think that it's both of those things. I think that what you saw in response to that was that there were 18 Democratic attorneys general in different states here in the U.S. who immediately sued to say you can't do that. Okay, that is tying up the opposition in legal time, angst, anger, everything else. It's also giving Trump, and I say this as not as an observation, not as an applause line. He's also giving a political hammer to his people to say, see, they want people here illegally. They want anchor babies,
Mm.
whatever pejorative term you're going to use. And then the last piece is that, look, it's a 6-3 Supreme Court majority with conservative justices. There's a good chance he could get one or two more in the next 2 years. And this could be a court unlike anything else. So remember that the 14th Amendment only lasts so long as, again, anybody, including the Supreme Court, is willing to actually enforce it. Now, the question is from enforcement, how do you do this, right? Like, how are you going to do this, right? So, who's having a baby? Where are they having it? And then do you start having people, go to, veterinarians and back office doctors who are, delivering babies because a woman is undocumented. She's going to have this baby, but she's afraid to go to a hospital.
Raf, as Reid said, Trump has pardoned around 1,500 people convicted for January the 6th and commuted the sentences of 14 more. Is releasing extremists who attack the police a green light for future violence? It's obviously a bad thing in itself. What's the message it sends?
Well, that's I think the key to it, really. I mean, certainly a lot of people have used the comparison with the 1920s and 1930s and used the sort of fascist terminology a lot around the Trump movement. And I'm always a bit wary of overlaying these historical analogies too precisely. But it's certainly, this is one of the actions where you think that is straight from the actual fascist playbook.
Mussolini issued an amnesty for black shirts.
Yeah, you quite literally, you do the things that Reid described brilliantly there about sort of finding the issues that are going to force your opponents to get tied up in a sort of a legalistic argument, whereas actually all they're doing is amplifying the issue that you want to have a position of moral urgency on. But also you have street thugs who can basically impose your will on the ground. That's Mussolini 101. But it did also make me think, actually, and this is something I really learned from my time in Russia, particularly in when once Putin had become president, that what really matters is the signal that might is right, and that the organs of power, if they are sort of incarnating the will of the leader, have authority to do whatever they want in pursuit of what the ideological program is. So if you take the example of what you're going to do, the executive order to essentially, or sending out ICE officials to go and, in quotes, sort of round up undocumented migrants, aside from the sort of on paper cruelty and authoritarian character of that move, also you've got to remember, how will those individuals behave when they are through the door of someone who they think is an undocumented migrant? So the licensing of a level of sort of pavement brutality by police, by officials, the way sentences will be given out, the way at every level, from federal down to the lowest level, if people think what they are doing is the enactment of a Trumpian will, then the way they exercise that power will be more cruel and tyrannical.
Now, one of the things where, the old "is Trump a fascist" question, and one of them was like, well, he's not interested in territorial expansion. Now, whether that's a necessity is debatable among historians, but, it was true. He plans to rename the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, which is just silly, and he can do it on American maps, but nobody else is. But when you put that together with his threats to get back the Panama Canal and Greenland, not quite sure how, we're looking at sort of imperialism or, a new manifest destiny as a real feature of his second term, because I'm also a little worried of whether this is like the bright, shiny object that suddenly you all have to write pieces about. Well, what if he could buy Greenland? Is it real?
Up to a point, I think, yes, you do have to take him seriously and literally. Obviously, with the Greenland thing, my instinct, again, like many people, was to think, well, this is a sort of a performative negotiating stance, just to say we need to talk about this in a way that corrodes the norms of international law, so that whatever my interests might be there, it's easier for me to achieve them without having to go through the normal processes and mechanisms. I can just haggle it to get what I want. It's not actually going to send the Marines to capture Greenland. But then, ultimately, there are all sorts of things that 5 years ago I didn't think would ever happen and have happened. So you have to, at some stage, you have to calibrate your view to that. Again, not wanting to repeat myself, but I do think the sort of the Putin, the sort of neo-Soviet model is actually quite useful here, because people, so imperialism, it conjures up a sense of, a 19th century or 18th, 19th century model of power. But there's actually a much more recent iteration of imperialism that casts the areas nearest you as what the Russians call the near abroad. So it's not as sovereign, because it's just part of your sphere, your backyard, your sphere of interest. And I see, Greenland, but certainly Panama in those terms. It's about an idea, and you mentioned manifest destiny. I think that's that. It's that on steroids. The idea that American sovereignty and the entitlement to be supreme in the world is such an overarching ethical imperative that it dissolves the idea of just crummy borders that might be there on a map somewhere. And again, this is very Putin-esque. It's the idea that although technically Ukraine is a different country, in a broader, more urgent sense of what Russia's national idea is of itself. Ukraine's not another country; it's part of Russia, and so it's that which is a very imperialistic way of looking at the world, but it's not imperialism. I think it's a very 21st century iteration of that.
And then they threw in it's the backyard stuff, but then also Mars.
But Mars is kind of America's backyard.
Yeah.
Just look up; it's a space. There it is.
So may I just weigh in on this just a little bit, because it's interesting you bring up manifest destiny, because Trump actually used that expression a couple of times in his inaugural address. And what was contradictory, and why I think so many folks don't understand and often get confused, is that in one breath he says we want to make sure that, or excuse me, under the Trump administration we will end all war. By the way, manifest destiny and we want to acquire territory, right? Well, those things don't go together. Yes, you can drop the 101st Airborne into Greenland. You can drop the 6th Special Forces Group into the Panama Canal. You can send the Marines across the Rio Grande into Mexico to chase down drug runners. But all of these things involve typically men with guns shooting at each other. Not to mention the fact that, like, the Chinese might have something to say about the Panama Canal. Like, they could turn off Los Angeles if they want to, right? And so this is also one where, just like, and I don't want to use, imperfect historical things, but how far can he push and get away with it? How far can he say, okay, maybe it's just a little living space, right? We just want that little slice of Panama, right? Oh, then we'll take the whole thing. And so I think that's the other part, which is you don't get peace if you're being expansionist in nature. And a lot of the people that voted for him, including some very senior, and wealthy type Republicans, wanted out of foreign wars. They didn't want Iraq. They didn't want Afghanistan anymore. They wanted to be isolationist. And now he's saying, no, I want that. But I think that to Rafe's point, I think this is a really good one, which is America has been an empire. Trump is now making us, I think, overtly imperial, if that makes
Can I just
sense.
add one little thing to that, which I think is very important as well, that point Regis made about a lot of Trump supporters and a lot of people in the Republican Party thinking this is an isolationist and therefore an anti-war proposition, that you just get America out of, the Iraq-style embroilments. This also has a tradition. I mean, the sort of the original America First movement from the early 1940s was explicitly about not getting involved in war. And in that way, this is where Trumpism is a bit divergent from European fascism in the 20s and 30s. It doesn't venerate, it's not a cult of war explicitly in the way that Mussolini's movement was.
Yeah. Rachel, some people complain that we pay too much attention to US politics, but I mean, there are good reasons for this. One of the executive orders pulls the US out of the Paris Climate Agreement for the second time. The US emits 11% of the world's greenhouse gases. And another pulls out of the World Health Organization, where the US contributes 1/5 of the total budget. Looking at climate emergency and the next pandemic, which one will affect your sleep the most?
Can I say both?
You
Is
can
that
say
an acceptable
both,
answer?
yes.
And also, of course, one very much informs the other. Like climate change and changing of environments, new pathogens, all of that. Simon Sharma wrote a really good book a couple of years ago. I think it's called Foreign Bodies, on the history of pathogens and vaccinations. And he starts off with a whole thing about, how environmental destruction is linked to the COVID pandemic and all wonderful things to lose sleep over. As a Brit, though, I am going to inject a note of not caution, not apathy, definitely not apathy, but kind of a sort of, I'm going to give British listeners permission this time round that you don't need to get into a tailspin about literally everything like we did last time round, because you will drive yourself mad. So there are things that Americans can do, but from a British perspective, I think we would all be saner if we focused on the things that Trump 2.0 is doing that will affect the rest of the world. So climate change, I think, is the one that really terrifies me. And obviously, like, it's very odd to kind of see that and the withdrawal of the US from the Paris Climate Accord while they're still putting out the fires in Los Angeles, and this is very much America's issue too. But that really worries me, because if we don't have American climate leadership, like, there isn't going to be international consensus. The World War III kind of new era of imperialism stuff, I think that is something for people in the UK and Europe to think about, particularly how Europe reacts to that. If we're in a new age of spheres of influence of rather than sort of smaller sovereign governments of kind of areas and blocks. I mean, if only there was a nearby block of sovereign nations that made decisions as a whole, that might be a good idea. Maybe that's something we should think about. I don't know. I'm not in politics. And also to think about the ways in which the Republican right, or this new iteration of the Republican Party, might be influencing the right in the UK. I think it's really important that we don't just assume that Britain is a smaller version of America with a different accent. Like, we have different politics here, and attempts to just kind of translate Trumpism wholesale to the UK haven't really worked, and there are very good reasons for that. But look at the language being used, look at some of the techniques, and focus on that and what's happening here, rather than what's the latest absolutely ridiculous thing? Oh, he's made himself a billionaire again because he launched a new crypto token on Inauguration Day. Like, we're going to get exhausted, guys.
You'll see, I restrained from mentioning that.
I've fallen into my own trap. I'm really sorry.
This is the thing we are not talking about. Trump legally wants to basically erase trans identity. He's rescinded Biden orders protecting gay and transgender people from discrimination. And then the idea is that you wouldn't be able to renew a passport under your current gender, biological sex reigns. Coming from an administration that restricts abortion and appoints alleged rapists and wife beaters to government and so on, what did you make of the framing that this was all to protect women?
I think the very hard focus on kind of anti-trans ideology does two things for Trump and the Republicans. One is it was used very effectively during the campaign to suggest that the Democrats and Kamala Harris had the wrong priorities, like that slogan, Kamala Harris cares about they, them, Trump cares about you. Like, that was effective. And the Democrats didn't really have anything to push back against that, even though she barely mentioned any of this stuff in her campaign. And the other thing it does is, as you say, it provides a smokescreen for the very obvious, very disturbing war on women's bodies and women's healthcare that the Republicans have been waging since long before Trump. I mean, this is sort of multi-decade efforts here. And I think it's interesting that one of the things that we saw during the first Trump presidency is where there were efforts to restrict abortion. Obviously, you had the Supreme Court decision, but where there were votes on it, the midterm votes or votes on individual ballot initiatives, they consistently failed. And the backlash to the restrictions of abortion access were, I think, dramatically higher and more energetic and more successful than the Republicans pushing that suggested. I think it's interesting that even on election day, when the country as a whole voted for Trump, 7 states approved measures to protect or expand abortion access. This stuff is not popular. Even in Florida, I mean, the Florida one didn't pass because it got 57% and needed a threshold of 60, which is just a metaphor, I think, for women's rights overall. But even in Florida, there was sort of mass popular support for this. And so the Republicans kind of know that they do have a women problem, and that the efforts on abortion and reproductive health care and things like banning the abortion pill are not popular. And so they are using this anti-trans agenda as a way to frame, no, look, we're the ones who really do support women. And I think it should be framed in that light as a distraction from the ways in which they're trying to roll back women's health provision across the country.
I think anyone who thinks that transphobia can be detached from homophobia and misogyny is just is sort of utterly deluded. I know that it's quite a popular view that they can be separated, but I just see them all as part of the same project for Trump. Reid, Trump, a liar, denied any connection to the hard right action plan Project 2025 during the campaign. You'll be familiar with this document. How many of these executive orders and the rhetoric he's using is familiar from that?
Most of them. And the person who is going to serve as one of the most powerful people in his administration and an architect of Project 2025 is a guy named Ross Vogt. He is going to be director of the Office of Management and Budget. It's not something a lot of people hear about, even here in the U.S., but they are sort of the people who air traffic control how federal agencies act, how federal money gets dispersed after it's been approved by Congress. Vogt was the guy who famously held up sending money to Ukraine that ultimately resulted in Donald Trump's first impeachment. So I think you're going to see a lot of this. And let me just go back to the part about trans. The other side of the doing the anti-trans stuff is it also will inevitably force Democrats, even against their better instincts, to jump to the 100% full-throated defense of trans issues broadly and give, again, Republicans what they want, which is, see, they're still out of touch. And Democrats are terrible at culture wars. They get drawn into the dark alley time and time again, as opposed to just saying, this is just one more bad thing Donald Trump has done, and trying to figure out how to broaden their appeal. They will once again stand on the landmine. But let me get back to Project 2025 and something we were talking about a little bit earlier, which is Project 2025 at its core is this. It's getting rid of the parts of the U.S. federal government that are designed to help people in favor of the parts of the U.S. federal government that are designed to control people. That's really what it is at its core. It's getting things. Listen, do I have any love for the U.S. Department of Education? Probably not. Most people don't, not because they hate it, but just because they don't think about it. If it goes away, will it be harmful? I assume it will be, again, to the people who can least afford it. But you're going to see much more activists if there are indeed ICE agents running around Chicago and elsewhere, rounding up migrants. You're going to see a lot more of that. If this nut Kash Patel gets installed as FBI director, you're going to see a lot more ugliness. If Pam Bondi, who's going to be the attorney general, if the White House says, go put a case on this person, she's going to go put a case on that person, right? She's not an independent actor. None of these people are. It's all about maintaining and centralizing and ultimately consolidating authority in the person of Donald Trump and in the hands of a small select group of mostly men around him.
Raf, when you're trying to work out what motivates Trump, which is perhaps not that big a mystery, I noticed that he complained about paying too much to the World Health Organization, just like he does with NATO. And then we talked about the Panama Canal, as well as the Manifest Destiny stuff. He goes, we get charged too much. So some of this stuff is clearly ideological. But can a lot of what he's doing be explained by his belief that America is a business that he has shares in? And is that perhaps some way of, I don't know, of kind of negotiating with him or understanding him, is that is ultimately what bugs him? It's like, you're taking my money.
Well, I think Reed would probably have a clearer understanding of this than me. But yes, I think broadly, but I would caveat that with, again, this point about the making a real fetish of an idea of American sovereignty, which is where the idea that you're getting ripped off by foreigners, that's the point where the kind of the business brain fuses with a nationalist brain.
Right, yeah.
So there's sort of the same thing. So, I mean, the NATO and EU example is very important here because, first of all, the argument that Europeans have been free riding on Pentagon spending massively predates Donald Trump. I mean, this is something that Barack Obama was annoyed about. I mean, this is a bipartisan complaint, and the argument, which contains a hefty element of truth, by the way, is that continental Europe was allowed to develop this very nice, cozy social market model where you have quite generous welfare states and you don't have to spend a load of money on guns because they're basically American soldiers. They're protecting you from the Soviet Union. I mean, that's a very crude characterization of it, but it's not entirely untrue. And so this idea that Europe needs to pony up for its own defense. Oh, and by the way, they should probably be buying those guns from America. Is both an ideological proposition and a business one. And then, same when you look at what does Donald Trump really hate about the European Union? Well, at one level, the principle, the idea that sovereign nation states can pool their sovereignty, can come together, and through multilateral treaties and organizations and a concept of trade that is a positive sum game where everyone gets stronger and more prosperous as a result, is sort of abhorrent to Trump's idea that it's always a zero sum game. And if the other person walks away from the table with a smile on their face, you've done a bad deal. And so, he can hate it at that level, but also the single market has enormous soft power because it's, hundreds of millions of people. The EU gets to set regulations, then American companies sort of have to comply with those regulations if they want to sell into the single market. So that's an affront to sovereignty. So those two, the business deal and the nationalist deal, they're part of the same impulse.
Rachel, we haven't talked that much about the actual inauguration, and I suppose it got overshadowed any of the other events by Elon Musk's right arm. There have been some more generous readings of his salute, and he claims it was an unfortunate expression of passion, much like Dr. Strangelove's at the end of the movie. Is there? I'm kind of interested in what everyone thinks, but how did you read that?
Trolling. Elon Musk loves to troll. I think he knew exactly what it meant. I don't think he did it specifically as look, I'm a Nazi now, but he did it knowing that it would make a whole load of people go, you can't do that. And then he goes, well, I just did. And anyway, it was a Roman salute. And he loves this stuff. It achieved one thing for him, which is that obviously Trump was the main character of the inauguration. Who's the second person that we're talking about? It's Elon Musk. So I think that's the context for it. And I'm kind of torn on this because, on the one hand, I don't want to give people who are bringing Nazi symbolism back into the discourse a free pass. I mean, we've already had, actually swastikas aren't anything to do with Hitler. They're a symbol of peace in Indian religion and all that rest of that bullshit. But on the other hand, we're going to get so much of this every single day for the next 4 years. We have to, I think, focusing on the executive orders, what do they actually do, which ones are going to have an impact, which ones are going to get tied up in the court, is a more productive use of all of our energies than, oh my God, can you believe what one of them did now?
Oh, I should also add that he then paraphrased the neo-Nazi 14 words about preserving the future of civilization.
By accident, obviously.
Again, by accident. But another bit of trolling. I'd almost like if on a 4chan level, he just came out and goes, yes, I am trolling.
Yeah.
Rather than being, oh no, I've been misunderstood.
But that makes it the troll. That's. If you admit it, it's not trolling. If you say, I don't know. But I will say, if I might just add one point on this, is it was indicative that the Anti-Defamation League was willing to give Elon Musk a pass on this. And I'm not okay with that. I am not okay with that. If he's trolling, let him troll. Somebody like a group like the ADL, they have one job, job, right? And giving a pass to the richest man in the world because he happens to be the richest man in the world, not okay.